Welcome to the Critic and the Pleb. I'm Ben, I'm the critic.
And I'm Caitlin, I'm the plebe. This is a podcast where we take turns choosing movies to offer our different perspectives and to hopefully entertain and or inform you all.
A brief warning. This podcast may contain adult content and will definitely contain spoilers. If you haven't seen the film in the episode title and don't want anything given away, please go see the film first and come back later to listen.
Nick Fury's calling you.
I don't really want to talk to Nick
Answer
Fury.
the phone.
Why?
Because if you don't talk to him, then I have to talk to him. I don't want to talk to him. You sent Nick Fury to voicemail?
I gotta go.
You do not ghost Nick Fury.
What up, dorks? What's up? We're just talking about the trip.
I'm here in St. Marco Polo. Oh,
I think MJ really likes me.
That reminds me when I first fell in love.
You're a very difficult person to contact, Spider-Man. This is Mr. Beck.
We could have used someone like you on my world.
Your world?
Beck is from Earth, just not ours. The snap tore a hole in our dimension.
You're saying there's a multiverse?
We have a job to do, and you're coming with us.
There's gotta be someone else you can use. What about Thor?
Off-world.
Captain Marvel? Unavailable. But I'm just a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Bitch, please, you've been to space.
Welcome to the Critic and the Plebe. Today we Avengers are discussing my latest plebe pick, Marvel Studios' 2019 superhero flick, Spider-Man: Far From Home, starring Tom Holland, Jake Gyllenhaal, Zendaya, Samuel L. Jackson, Jon Favreau, and Jacob Batalon.
The Letterboxd plot overview says, Peter Parker and his friends go on a summer trip to Europe. However, they will hardly be able to rest. Peter will have to agree to help Nick Fury uncover the mystery of creatures that cause natural disasters and destruction throughout the continent. Now, usually, a movie on this podcast is either a critic pick or a plebe pick, but on this podcast, and usually for superhero movies, we generally just call it a draw. So, why did we choose this one, Caitlin?
I think we've gotten to the point where we just have to see any Marvel movie. We've connected really well with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I've really enjoyed all the movies and the awesome stories that they create. So this was the next Marvel movie. We needed to see it.
Well, at the very least, the awesome characters they create.
I like the stories too. But yeah, the characters are definitely the bigger draw. So, first of all, this is the first kind of standalone superhero movie after Avengers Endgame. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how this fits into the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole and how it follows up Endgame, because that's a pretty big movie and a pretty big sequence in the universe to follow up. So how do you think it did in that respect?
This is the closing of Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, it takes place, I believe, exactly 8 months after the events of Endgame, and we are left with a high school, Peter Parker's high school, reckoning with the blip, as they call it, the blip being the phenomenon where the people who were gone for 5 years due to Thanos' snap coming back into existence. And for high school, it's awkward because you have these people that were gone for 5 years but are still in the same grade, but yet there's people in the same grade that look 5 years older than you, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, it was interesting how they kind of discussed what happened after Thanos' takeover of the universe and how people just came back the same age, having no memory of what happened. They just returned back, and life had moved on without them. So there's definitely a lot of adjustment. Even Peter Parker's aunt was somebody that was taken away in the blip, and it seemed like she was almost leading a non-profit fundraiser or something for people that had been blipped away and their lives were basically replaced while they were gone.
Yeah, it was like a homeless charity for homeless people that were specifically displaced by the blip, is how she put it in that little scene. So I'm happy that they are continuing that idea and reckoning with it, just like the Russos did in that gap at the beginning of Endgame where Captain America is having the grief counseling and everything. So they're still dealing with the repercussions of that, and they do that a little bit here, which is nice. But the bigger thing is that we have Peter Parker dealing with the loss of his father figure in Tony Stark, which we're going to talk about Peter's arc and all of his sort of conflicts that he has to deal with in this movie a little later on in the podcast. But that is supposed to, at least, carry a lot of the emotional weight of this story.
Right. It's kind of like he is still reckoning with the idea of being a great superhero. It's like Tony left him a legacy and kind of told him, you're going to be the next Iron Man. And Peter is now trying to deal with, am I actually good enough to do that? He's kind of afraid, and he really just wants to be a normal teenager. And that's at least half of the movie, I would say, where he's more in that mindset where he's scared to accept that responsibility.
Exactly. We might as well just talk about the arcs now. We can move around our talking points a little bit. But so yeah, point one, everybody in the world is just kind of getting back used to this blip thing, and that's again just that little segment at the beginning. We have Peter trying to grieve over his father figure, slash fill the shoes of his father figure, slash try to be a normal teenager trying to go on a vacation and take a much deserved break. But he's also trying to woo Mary Jane, the crush that he has in his class that's also going on this trip, which that's nothing unusual. The idea of Peter Parker having to balance normal high schooler stuff with superhero stuff, that's nothing unusual for the Spider-Man comics or films. But overall, I feel like it's usually done a little more effectively in the other iterations of Spider-Man that we've seen on screen. There's something of a thematic synergy that the others were able to accomplish, and they were able to pull off this balancing act of, all right, he's got all these problems and all these little conflicts, but it still meshes well, and it doesn't feel bloated in the other ones. And this one, it kind of feels bloated, like it's spread a little too thin across the whole movie. At least it did for me.
The issue that I kind of had, I didn't mind that he was like having those moments, that conflict of wanting to be a teenager and like bouncing back and forth. And I thought a lot of the ways they did that were pretty humorous, where he's like trying to be a teenager, but then, oh no, he's getting called into doing this. I didn't mind all of that. I kind of minded that he switched. It was like within one scene that he switched from kind of being that way to, okay, now I do accept the responsibility fully and I'm going into this and I like get what I need to do. There's kind of an emotional scene where he just talks about missing Iron Man, Tony Stark, and right after he got hit by a train. And that was like the wake up call for him, I guess, that like, okay, this is serious and now I need to be the superhero. But for me, it just happened really quickly. It's like they could have done it more gradually throughout the movie rather than, no, I want to be a teenager, no, I want to be a teenager, bam, I'm hit by a train, okay, now I get it, now I'm going to be essentially the next Iron Man, because I feel like that's what they're trying to kind of shoehorn him into in this movie.
Yeah. And I also feel like there were also some issues with, for me anyway, with how Nick Fury was handling him and talking to him. I feel like Nick Fury, maybe it was just the fact that Nick Fury's scenes were super repetitive in the movie. Like there really wasn't very much for him to do at all, and he reprimands Peter the exact same way across about half of his scenes.
That part made sense to me though, because Peter really hadn't changed much yet. There hadn't been any growth in Peter's character yet, so it made sense for Nick Fury to need to do that. It seemed pragmatic. It wasn't necessarily sensitive, but it kind of seemed like something he needed to do. I don't know.
Regardless, the middle of his arc just kind of feels muddled. I feel like the growth at the end ends up not feeling as well developed. like you're saying, maybe it's the fact that it just feels pretty fast, just with the getting hit by a train and then deciding to go full for this.
And then there's a moment where Happy comes and picks him up in a jet, and he's designing a new suit, and the way they're shooting it and the way Happy reacts is supposed to look like he's acting exactly as Iron Man would have acted. Like, oh yeah, this is the protege, this is what he's supposed to be doing. But I thought just trying to push Spider-Man into being like Iron Man as a character didn't quite work for me, because I feel they're very different superheroes, and the ways that they've behaved so far have been very different. I mean, even the fact that Peter doubts himself, whereas I feel like Iron Man always had a lot more confidence and a lot more assurance that he knew what he was doing and that he could be the hero. It was almost like they were trying to make Spider-Man be the next leader of whatever would be the next Avengers. That's what it felt like. I have no idea if that's what they were trying to convey, but that's kind of what it felt like to me.
I think they definitely admit that he's not going to be the next Iron Man. He needs to be something right now. He needs to take on some sort of mantle, but I think they recognize, and the film explicitly says that you're going to be different than him.
Right, but kind of playing that same role.
You still need to wield, somebody needs to wield these responsibilities or shoulder some of these responsibilities. And there's also just the idea of him going through adolescence too. But either way, something about it just doesn't feel articulated. Those stakes don't feel articulated. There's a lot of these conflicts that, again, don't flow as seamlessly as they do in what's still the best Spider-Man movie, in my opinion, Spider-Man 2. There's just some sort of disconnect there.
I think one thing that didn't have a whole lot of disconnect in it, though, was kind of Mysterio's storyline and him as a villain. What did you think of Mysterio?
Well, with Mysterio, he's the strongest aspect of the film for me. He's a character from the comics that I've always wanted to see portrayed on screen. I'm not disappointed with how he was portrayed. They updated his backstory for the universe in a pretty seamless way. I feel like Jake Gyllenhaal was pretty well cast, just based on what he's been doing recently, like essentially playing a Nightcrawler type character, but as a supervillain, more or less, is what he's playing. And I'm glad that they went with his full comic book costume too, because I was worried that when they announced that Mysterio was going to be the villain in this, that they would shy away from how he looks in the comic book, but luckily he looks exactly the same as he does in the comic book. So I was satisfied with his character overall. I was also satisfied with the illusion battle that he goes through with Spider-Man, especially that first one, where it's just very surreal, trippy, a little psychedelic, just how Spider-Man's going through all this, and a lot of it looks like each frame of that first one looks like it's straight out of a comic book panel, actually, and probably was inspired by, at least, I think I remember at least a few shots that come directly from some Mysterio comics, which I appreciated, and I thought that was one of the most well-done battles in any of the Marvel movies, certainly in any of the standalone superhero Marvel movies. So that was a high point of the entire MCU, I feel like, was that first Mysterio battle.
I agree with a lot of that. I think Mysterio was really interesting as a villain. I kind of liked that his motivation essentially was that he felt wronged by Tony Stark and therefore wanted to kind of take over that role as like Iron Man, as highly valued superhero in the community and in the world, and everyone looks up to me. Thought it was interesting that he had that kind of backstory. I really liked the theme of illusions that Mysterio brought to the movie, that just people are willing to believe kind of anything you tell them, and he makes a joke like, they already believed all of this. Like, it was so easy when he's talking to all of the people that are working with him. Like, they'll believe anything.
Because he
like,
convinces Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. that he's an alien from another planet and he has to defeat these 4 elemental monsters that he's really just generating through holograms.
And he eventually tricks Spider-Man into giving him Tony Stark's kind of last remaining very powerful technology, an AI or AR system called Edith.
Which is essentially Jarvis/Vision 2.0.
Essentially, yeah. That allows him to make all of these really neat illusions and allows him to make it look like he's fighting these big evil forces when really he's not. He doesn't care about the casualties. He doesn't care about any of that. He cares about the glory and the way things look. He just kind of says that people will believe anything when you put it in front of them and when you tell them, and they're not going to question it. And it's true through the movie, and kind of true at the end in the little teaser in the credits as well.
Which is another strange thing about the movie that didn't really work for me, is that the first credits teaser is vital for the story of, like, it fits in with the story of the film. It will undoubtedly lead into what the tone is for the next Spider-Man sequel, whenever that happens in a couple of years. Because it's Mysterio putting out a video just revealing Peter Parker's identity and making it seem like Peter/Spider-Man killed him out of jealousy. Because Spider-Man wanted to be the next Iron Man.
And that he was the one who orchestrated the attack.
All these drone attacks in London, yeah. And that's sandwiched between the first ring of credits and the longer ring of credits. And it also features J. Jonah Jameson, aka J.K. Simmons, again, in a new version of the Daily Bugle. Instead of a traditional newspaper, it's a InfoWars-esque news desk, and he's just doing his J. Jonah Jameson thing and announcing all this lurid news.
Right. So despite its weird placement in the credits, it kind of wrapped up the illusions theme for me and really pushed that idea forward that people will believe anything you tell them. Like, obviously, Spider-Man didn't orchestrate the attack and he didn't do all of that, but it seems pretty clear that people are now going to believe this, and it's going to be really difficult in whatever film it comes up in next.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting choice because that's something that really throughout the comics isn't a thing. Peter is able to maintain his identity pretty strongly in his secret identity, and that leads to a whole lot of the conflicts throughout all of his movies. So I'm a little worried to see how they handle that, but if they're trying to update it for the modern world and all this fake news and all these illusions, then hopefully they can take it to an interesting place. It has some potential, but I'd be lying if I wasn't a little bit wary of how they're going to juggle that.
It could be a cool angle to tackle if they do it right. Mysterio is pretty obvious, at least to me. I didn't trust him from the start and knew that something was up. I was wondering if that was deliberate or if that was poor mystery writing. I'm not quite sure.
That's just how these things work. That's just how blockbuster movies worked and have worked for the past our lifetime.
That the twist is so easy to see?
Yeah.
I don't think it should be that easy. It'd be nice if it wasn't.
It'd be nice, but it just... Plus, there's so much of a built-in comic book audience that knows that Mysterio exists and knows that he's a Spider-Man villain to begin with. So
I suppose.
I think they're only trying to hide it to an extent because everybody knows that Mysterio's a bad guy, or, a fair portion of the audience.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know how deliberate it was that he was pretty easy to guess as the villain. It may have been fairly deliberate that they didn't care, which is fine. It was just interesting to me.
And I guess that's part of the issue overall, too, for me, is that it does suffer in comparison or in succession to Endgame, and that Endgame was this culmination of a decade worth of storytelling. And now we're taking a pretty hard left turn back to just an episodic, standalone Marvel movie that, yes, fits into the Ultimate Universe, and I can appreciate it within that context, but the emotional impact is lessened a little bit when you're going back to again, kind of a cookie cutter blueprint of here's a standalone Marvel adventure. Here's a middle chapter standalone Marvel adventure. We're doing that again now.
Right. The stakes feel so much less that it felt a little bit harder to get invested for me. Just watching the movie, I wasn't as anxious watching it as I've been in recent Marvel movies just because of the higher stakes. Which isn't to say anything necessarily against the movie, it's just something to get used to again.
Exactly. I would agree with that. It is something that we'll definitely have to get used to because obviously there's going to be further Marvel films. I believe Black Panther 2 is the next one that'll be coming out. But yeah, it's funny because typically standalone Marvel movies have a villain problem. This one definitely doesn't have a villain problem. Mysterio is one of the most satisfying villains in the MCU, certainly one of the most interesting, at the very least. But I still can't shake the feeling that this Far From Home has a hero problem with Spider-Man, and that arc just not landing.
Right. And I wouldn't say it's because of their performance, because as usual, I think Tom Holland does an amazing job as Spider-Man.
And all around the cast does.
Yeah, the cast was great.
No issues with the performances in general, I would say.
Yeah, I think it comes more down to just, maybe they needed to cut out some scenes that would have made it feel more gradual. Maybe the writing just didn't go in that direction. But either way, I agree with you.
I'm just trying to think now if there were any weak performances or anything like that, but yeah, I really don't think so. Just uniformly good cast. Nothing mind-blowing. Like even Jake Gyllenhaal, like it's a well-written villain, an interesting villain, but even the performance doesn't rise above that was good. That works.
Overall solid, but nothing majorly exciting.
Well, how would you grade it then? Where does this shake out for you?
That's kind of the description of a B movie for me. Like overall, pretty solid. No problems with it really, but nothing like blew my mind. I really enjoyed all the action scenes. I thought the humor was there for the most part. It didn't feel quite as funny as some of the other Marvel movies have, but it was still funny. It was still enjoyable. I liked the villain a lot, and I liked the overall theme, but there was nothing that really impressed me to want me to give it an A type grade. So I'm sitting at a B.
I'm sitting at a B minus right now. In that, again, follows just got to get back to that episodic Marvel arc. Maybe watching it alongside Spider-Man: Homecoming will feel better than watching it right after, just a couple months after Endgame, that being the most recent Marvel movie I've seen. But again, it doesn't quite land as an arc. It's just kind of your classic example of a muddled middle chapter, which I guess the MCU in general, if you're looking at just standalone trilogies of characters, Iron Man 2 is weak. Thor: The Dark World is one of the weakest in all of the MCU, and those are both middle chapters. So perhaps that's just a middle chapter problem that hopefully they'll be able to fix with future Marvel characters that they bring into the fold. But again, I don't hate it. Definitely worth seeing for Mysterio. Definitely worth seeing if you're an MCU fan. But
Agreed.
I wouldn't expect it to exceed Spider-Man: Homecoming. Next up, on the Critic and the Plebe, I will be choosing a film of a critical substance, as I am wont to do. And I'm still not totally sure what that's going to be. But make sure that you follow us on Letterboxd. Make sure that you subscribe to us on YouTube. Comment if you agree or disagree with our takes. And until then, happy viewing.